The Discourse starts right now with Cheryl Oates and Erika Barudis.
Welcome back to The Discourse. There is so much going on right now. It's going to be tough to fit it all into one episode, but we are going to try. The federal election officially underway now, and what was an inconceivable prediction mere months ago, the Liberals appear to be leading. Trump tariffs continue to loom over Canadian businesses, and AHS has now officially filed a statement of defense in the corrupt care scandal.
I knew you were going to say that, Kate. I want to talk about campaigns, promises, and positioning. First, I want to address and get your feedback. I think that I'm kind of pulling off this voice, or I sound like I'm dying. What do you think?
You're making the best of it.
Thank you. I needed to show up and do this. We have too much content to not and to hold off for another week. So sorry, folks, bear with me. This is actually better than I think it was when we were on Jesperson on Monday.
I think it's also possible that I might get to speak in this episode.
I said this is God's way of telling me to shut up. But anyways, let's kick it off with the latest poll numbers. Not in my party's favor, but Angus Reid just released new numbers this week. And just to be clear, this was out in the field before the writ dropped, aka before any policy, before any huge rallies, and before people started to actually hear Mark Carney.
Yeah, but there is, a number of polls out now that see the same trend line. We'll put it up on the screen here. On the face of it, if you look at just vote intention, it's good numbers for the Liberals and really for no one else. You see this kind of crazy upward trend for the Liberals from 37%. Actually just earlier this month to 46% now. Overall, the Conservatives have held relatively stable. If you go back to December, there's obviously a drop in their support. But from the last poll to this poll, they're sitting from 37 to 38%. And then pretty much every party, including the NDP, is heading down. And most of them, all of them now, except for the Liberals and the Conservatives, are now in single digits.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The Conservatives are still holding place, but we are seeing, again, that continuation of the trajectory that we said Carney was getting. He was looking statesman-like, going overseas, having some missions. And this was all kind of captured in the field before the writ dropped on Sunday, because they were reporting it on the 24th. So still many days to go in the election, but it's actually showing, the bloc is interesting because that's where usually Liberals can pick up some seats in, especially Montreal. I'm so interested to see that's probably where some of those 2 points went. And then your party continues to downward spiral and be almost nothing. So how does that make you feel?
Definitely, this is a tough election start for the NDP. There is a question of how relevant is the NDP in this election, but I will say, the NDP, whether we're talking provincially or whether we're talking federally, has always been a party that punches above its weight and always been a party that exceeds expectations. And I think their offer is quite realistic. They're not saying we're best positioned to take on Donald Trump. Jagmeet Singh is best positioned to be the Prime Minister of Canada. They're reminding people that in every election, whether they're at every term, whether they've been the third party, the fourth party, or the official opposition, the NDP has pushed the parties in power to protect things and to sometimes grow things that we care about. As Canadians, we care about a lot, like Medicare, or in this most recent term, like pharmacare and dental care. And so they're going to spend the cap. They're going to spend $30 million. But rather than do this sort of cross-country campaign, they're going to be really targeted. So $30 million really going to protecting their incumbent seats. And that will help them, I think, punch above their weight. It worked really, really well in this last election in Ontario. But I guess we'll see. There's still a lot of campaign to play out. So we have seen lots of former NDP supporters moving over to the Liberals in a anyone but Poilievre scenario. But that percentage on the overall poll doesn't really translate into how much work is going into ridings that the NDP already hold.
Are you referencing your Rod Leola that left the NDP caucus?
Referencing him how?
There's rumors that he's going to go Liberal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were even seeing it in Alberta. No, I'm just wondering.
Oh,
if that's
as someone defecting. No, I'm just talking about in general. If you talk to you can see. You don't need me to tell you. You can look at that poll and see that some of the NDP vote is going to the Liberals. Right. And that is that's not necessarily people saying I'm not a New Democrat now. It's saying people saying I really, really don't want Pierre Poilievre to be Prime Minister.
I want to ask you, is that different? Maybe for the NDP in Alberta or in West versus if you jumped ship and went to a party from NDP to run for Liberals, would your response with the federal party be different?
You mean, is it more acceptable in the West?
Yeah, is it more acceptable to go become a new Democrat to be a liberal versus like you're kicked out forever. See you later, maybe in the East.
I think it's like if you're a sitting MLA and you leave the party to go run for the Liberal Party, I think that's offensive no matter where you are. I don't think jurisdiction matters. In terms of like actual voting, there's been lots of frustration with the federal party across the prairies and in Western Canada for a long time. And I think you're seeing that some of that sentiment come out in people's voting intentions, where they haven't necessarily felt like the federal party reflected the economics of prairie pragmatism or certain policies. That has been brewing for a really long time. And so that exists more in Western Canada and across the prairies than it does in the East. And you're going to hear more of that.
I was laughing at you is that I forgot to turn on my light.
Saw that.
Anyways, I know. I was like, let there be light. For our listeners, I didn't have my vanity light on. Anyways, back to this. Okay, so the NDP is starting to collapse. The Bloc is starting to collapse. But coming back to what you're talking about, both of those parties run more issue-based and targeted, obviously the Bloc within the Quebec borders, but more issue-based. So do you see them going up? Like, I mean, they can only kind of go up now, but do you see that as like you said, punching above your weight, that we'll see the NDP come out where they usually sit just above double digits?
I just don't know. When you look at a broad poll like this, when you look at a Canada-wide poll, you will never see individual riding dynamics reflected in those polls. So the NDP could be shoring up their incumbents really well, but that's not going to come out as like the NDP gaining 10 points in the polls. The idea that they're going to grow their seats, like not impossible, but at this point in the campaign, it's pretty tough. So I don't expect, even if they're holding all their incumbents, to see a giant jump in numbers. The same can be said, I mean, in Saskatchewan, we saw our numbers go up. The NDP saw our numbers go up, like overall, just very steadily and very encouragingly throughout the campaign. And in places like Yorkton, we swung the vote there by 30 points. That's a huge jump in terms of what our polling was telling us. That still isn't enough to win that seat.
Right.
So that when we look at these broad-based polls, I think it's tough to say like, we know an exact seat count because the specific local dynamics are never reflected in these.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that even impacts too, like the overall vote intention doesn't always tell the full story, as you said. So, like if we're digging into the rest of the poll, we're going to throw up, the voter commitment. I think this one's actually more interesting than the last because we're looking at basically like your locked in support. So Angus Reid also asked our respondents how committed they were to their vote. And you can see that the CPC, like the vote there is pretty solid. 72% describe themselves as definitely sticking, 22% fairly committed, and only 6% is not very committed. And no one said that they were going to like switch sides. So when you compare that to, as we show here, the Liberals, where we know there's a little bit more volatility, only half are definitely sticking, another 36% are fairly committed, and 12% aren't very committed or are not committed at all. To me, that like really shows that the Liberal supporters continue to express like less commitment to their party of choice compared to the CPC. And for me, that's a good sign that, that slow trajectory you talked about, the NDP, we could hopefully see from the CPC during this election.
Yeah, and I think like
Go.
I'll try to cut that out.
No, you can just leave it. I don't care.
Yeah, I think I'm not surprised by the federal vote commitment. A lot of those voters just newly decided in the last couple of months that they would now vote Liberal in this election. So we always knew based on the polls that there's a ton of volatility, and this tells us that there remains a ton of volatility. I think if I'm the Conservatives looking at this, I'm pumped that like their people are sticking with them. Like their people are not thinking about jumping ship. There's a small portion that might change their vote, but overall people are very, very, if you're voting Conservative, you are very committed to voting Conservative. And then one more slide before we move on, because I think this one is quite telling as well. People were asked about their opinions of party leaders and how they've changed over the last couple of weeks. So 37% say their opinion of Pierre Poilievre has gotten worse. Only 13% say it's gotten better. And if you compare that to Mark Carney's, granted, not as many people know anything about Mark Carney as do Poilievre, but their view of Mark Carney improved. 46% of people say that's almost half of people say their impression of Mark Carney has improved. 25% say that it's gotten worse. So we know how people feel about the leaders, whether they like the leaders, whether they want to have a beer or a coffee with the leaders really matters. And often these kind of numbers can sort of dictate what the momentum on the campaign is. So when we see Pierre Poilievre's likability numbers getting worse and Mark Carney's getting better, that can be one indication of momentum.
Yeah. And I would say though, again, when it was happening, being, nerdy and like when it's in the field, this was Mark Carney taking office, a trajectory because, like you said, no one really knew him. So I think that instant likability factor was increased. No one was really talking about the NDP or the Bloc, and they kind of, stayed relatively, like there's a big portion of both of them that stayed the same, like 75 for the Bloc and 63 for the NDP, bigger than both of those other parties, that the targets and the spotlight was on both. Pierre, who was being criticized at the time for, your one-liners or your clickbait type of videos and things like without pure policy. So I do think that, as we've said on other ones, that this Conservatives need to pivot. I think we've really started to see that in the first few days of the campaign, because he's putting out, looks like it's going to be policy every day from that campaign. So I think it's interesting, because also looking at the Bloc, like how much can they actually leverage of the Carney brand? Because once we start getting into the campaign, look at 2023 for us. Danielle couldn't run from the UCP record, and Rachel couldn't run from her record 4 years before that. And so I think one of the strategic moves, and I'm interested to see what the NDP does with this to grab back some votes, is how they say, well, Carney is still tied to the Liberal agenda, even though he's coming out with a very different campaign plan.
Looks a lot more like the Conservative agenda, actually.
I know. That's what I mean. Like, he's coming out and it's quite a far swing for Liberals. And I don't know if everyone that was initially on board will still hold on board, because he's becoming more decently right of center as opposed to a pure centrist or left of center, where we've really seen the Liberals hang out for the last 9 years.
Yeah, I mean, in the first few days, we've had pretty like matchy campaign promises.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have a carbon tax no matter which party you choose. You have a middle class tax cut no matter which party you choose. You have no GST on $1 million houses no matter which party you choose. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's kind of two issues in this election: affordability and who can take on Donald Trump. And I think for the Liberals, like, this is a strategic move from the Liberals, is by basically like matchy with the CPC, they're taking that, they're like completely neutralizing that affordability argument. Granted, Pierre Poilievre's promises all save people a bit more money.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that those details really matter.
And there was the seniors announcement, which I think really speaks to a base that we struggled as Conservatives to get over the last few years. Like, a lot of them have gone maybe more liberal. But I think that, again, giving them changes in their withdrawals of RRSPs, like from 71 to 73, not having to take it out, allowing them to make more money when they are outside of in their retirement phase, to be able to basically earn more for themselves before having to dip into their RRSPs. I think that that one is actually going to be huge for that demographic. Now, who knows what the Liberals come out and promise, but I think it's going to be really interesting once they start adding all that up and having to answer, okay, so your revenue's going down. Where do you get that money?
Yeah. The age-old question: how are you going to pay for it? The other thing I wanted to talk about, because you were trolling my LinkedIn page, was the kickoff for the Conservative campaign, which I had said, which you were trolling me on. I said, like I can't imagine.
I was simply asking for it to be a subject matter in our podcast.
So the CBC kicked off the. How am I doing a thumbs up?
I don't know.
The CBC
you liked my comment?
Kicked off their campaign with a massive rally in the GTA. I'm not saying, I certainly wasn't saying the rally didn't look good. I think the rally looked good. I was just saying, as if I'm thinking with a campaign director hat on, oh my God, that looked like a headache. Not to say that they couldn't anticipate the first day of the campaign, but like, everybody's listening. The whole country's listening. If there's one day that people pay attention, it's the day that an election is called. And yet the Conservatives decided to pull off this massive rally. And then my other, not necessarily criticism of it, but my other concern around it, if it was the campaign I was running, would be, okay, you set the bar. You had a massive rally. You showed energy. You showed enthusiasm. You showed that thousands of people are willing to turn out. You've got to be able to do that now better, to demonstrate building momentum from now for the next 36 days. And that is a tough act to follow.
And I was more like, you were looking at it as like the risk in the campaign effort that takes. When the leader comes to Edmonton, I'm like, oh no, like time off doors and resources allocated to getting people to this rally. Now, I think where I was like, I want to talk about this is the underestimation that maybe you had, because you're like, this is a ballsy move to do on day one, because you got to keep that momentum. But this is Pierre's whole thing that he's done for a year and a half. So I was actually thinking I would agree. Like if I had the campaign director hat on, I'd be like, oh Lord, like that is so hard to put on repeat. But then he did even bigger in Hamilton, and Hamilton is not conservative hunting ground. So you've done Toronto and Hamilton, and I think he'll continue to draw those crowds because one, I think that those are probably not people that are hitting the doors. Like they're a different audience that Pierre speaks to than some of their campaigners. Now you might have your candidates and stuff. I hope you don't. I actually hope that that's just for people that are following this phenomenon and came out to rallies for Pierre before, and that you still have your campaign teams functioning because, as you know, you don't win votes by getting people off the doors and at a rally. So I just think it was like an underestimation because you're like, that's very aggressive, but then he did it the next night. And I think we'll actually see him draw crowds like that across this entire campaign. So I don't think he set it too high because of the machine in which already operates because he's been campaigning for so long. And I just thought it was interesting because, yeah, then it was like, since you've said that, and I get why you said it, it's like, he has put proof in the pudding. And I suspect that this is a strategy we're going to see because it's the Liberals attacked him on day one. And he kind of just like, I don't think it got the same airtime because of the you can't not report on the size of this rally. And like the scanning of B-roll of all those people standing in line, I think took the oxygen out of maybe some of the grenades that were being thrown at him. So yeah. I think it might work.
The other, and certainly I was never saying they couldn't do it. I was just imagining
no, it's a
what
lot,
it takes
though.
to pull it off.
Totally. I think there's probably two different teams. There's got to be.
The other thing about like the strategy is that Pierre, this is his like superpower, right? Like he can pull off these rallies. He can get people chanting, you know, they're all fists in the air, axe the tax. People are really pumped about it. Mark Carney's not going to do that. Like he's not a rally guy. He's not even like a rally speech guy. He's not going to like rile people up in a room and get them going. The people who are like pumped about Mark Carney being the steady hand former governor of the Bank of Canada are not turning out to a rally to cheer on his rhyming talking points. So it is a distinction I think that the Conservatives have rightly drawn, and it makes sense that they'll do it day after day. I just personally would not want to organize that.
Me neither. That's why I'm like, good on the team. And like I said, I think there's probably a rally team to allocate resources just to that for, like you said, the grandiose impact that Pierre can draw. How do you think that Carney's doing, though? Like, I am actually really happy every time he gets up to the microphone because I don't think that that's his strong suit. But how do you think he's doing?
I think he's doing exactly what he needs to do. Like, I don't think he can do what Pierre's doing. I don't think he can, you know, go rally a crowd. But I mean, he has conceivably turned some vote around, not because he is like this movie star, like gravitas, star power kind of guy, because he's not that kind of guy. Like people are looking to him saying like, we want a guy who can really like sit down at the table with Donald Trump, take him on, push him to, you know, make decisions that are in the interest of Canada. And I think every time he comes to a microphone personally, that is the guy that he's representing. And he can't, I mean, there's no point in pretending that he's, you know, star powered, like doing this, the kind of stuff that Justin Trudeau did. That's just not his brand. And that's not why people like him.
Yeah. But do you think that there's maybe a side or an arrogance that people didn't see from him that is coming out? Like, again, how he's been talking to media is like almost treating people like they're idiots when he responds, or like, well, I'm going to frame this how it should have been asked. And like, it's a very different tone that I thought was going to come out of this rise above statesmen. He kind of has an air of like the Jim Prentice arrogance that was criticized to the PCs in 2015.
I mean, if he keeps doing that, for sure, I think it turns people off. So far, I don't think that's what's breaking through. Like most people aren't watching the press conferences, they're reading the stories or watching the clips. Yep. And for sure, like the first day when he was being asked about his disclosure, he got lots of coverage for the way that he interacted with journalists. But I don't think that's really the story of this campaign so far. Could it be? Like, could it turn into a place where it's like, this guy's arrogant, he's unlikable? Sure. And if that's the way that he acts during the debates, absolutely. When people are tuning in to say, like, do I like this guy? Do I want him to be the leader of my country? If he's arrogant through the debates, I think a lot of people turn away from him. But so far, I think he's handling it fine.
Yeah. What do you think the ballot box question is as of today, right now?
I think it's still probably Trump, and we'll see what happens on April 2nd. But I think it's probably still who can lead Canada through what is the greatest threat that we've seen in our generation.
Yeah. I found it interesting because I don't disagree. I think they're both trying to frame it as like, who can better stand up for Canada, which double-edged sword, because then they can talk about what they can control as opposed to not. Because like, I mean, I've seen that Carney's tried to reach out to Trump. I mean, he chose not to go to the States. Like, he hasn't even really addressed how he would, besides like, here's my resume, which we both know doesn't necessarily translate to reality. So I think you're right. I think that's still the ballot box question, but we'll see. Both campaign narratives are very much on affordability right now.
So all of this is happening in the background of our federal election is the U.S. economic threats, including tariffs on Canadian industries, which, you know, are changing from day to day. Donald Trump has already imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum and threatened to bring in more coming April 2nd.
Right. And I think sometimes we find it hard to imagine what this actually means for businesses here at home. And so we wanted to kind of clear some of that up. So we're welcomed and happy to have Alberta Forest Production Association, AFPA, which is a nonprofit association that has represented the sustainable forest industry in Alberta since 1942. To clear some of that up, they're our second largest industry in Alberta, so we can get a little bit more into what some of these tariffs mean for them, as well as Albertans and Canadians. So it's a trade association with members that represent companies that manufacture lumber, panel board, pulp, paper, and secondary manufactured wood products in Alberta. And so I want to introduce a friend, a running companion to our panel today, President and CEO Jason Krips. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Erika. Hi, Cheryl. Thank you so much for having me on. Super excited for the conversation.
Yeah. And Jason, we both know you from previous lives and in fact have both run with you. And I will never forget our lovely run through the Beijing book market a few years back. But yeah, nice to have you in this second movie.
It's great to be here. I love having second acts, so this is great. Yeah. This is great. Yeah. And you both talked about threats, and you've hit it really well from a forestry perspective. We see ourselves actually under what we would describe as a triple threat. So we're already on the lumber side actively in a duty situation. So we have annualized duties on the softwood lumber dispute that have been in place since 2016, 2017. Right now, we're sitting at about 14% on those duties. They're scheduled to go to about 30% come the fall. So that's the first threat. The second threat is actually the 25% that's going to be potentially assessed on all forestry products from Canada, possibly as early as April 2nd. So that's the second threat. So that's 25% on top of what is now 14%, moving to 30%. So that's the second threat, which puts us in a tax situation of 50 to 55%. And then on top of that, President Trump over the last 2 weeks has issued a 232 investigation of a national security assessment under the Trade Expansion Act of, I think it's 1962. And that, after the 270 days of review, or up to 270 days of review, could result in another punitive level of tariffs or duties without negotiations. Really, we see it as the forestry sector an existential threat coming at us.
I think, like Jason, I mean, unique for the forest product industry because you have this layer on layer on layer of penalties that many industries are not facing. But could you, for people who are listening, could you just talk about what this means for Canadians and Canadian jobs and what the impacts, if I don't work in forestry and I don't work in an associated industry, why should I care about this?
Absolutely. From an Alberta perspective, we represent about $14.1 billion of economic impact to the province, to the provincial economy. And that represents about 30,000 jobs right across the province, whether that's direct or indirect. There are about 15,000 direct and 15% or 15,000 indirect, and about a GDP formula of about just close to $7 billion. So we actually do contribute quite substantially to our economy in Alberta, and it represents just over $800 million into the provincial coffers from a stumpage dues perspective. So those $800 million pay for hospitals, roads, and the like. And so all of a sudden, if we're hit with, potentially up to a triple threat of our main customer in the United States, we could be seeing shrinkage of jobs, shrinkage of mills, because it is by far our largest trading partner. It's an important one, and it's something that we're paying particular attention to. Not only do we have an economic impact, but we are active in 70 communities across the province. Are we predominantly Northern Alberta? Yes, but we do have a big footprint from an employment perspective in Calgary and Edmonton, and obviously Edmonton North. But we're very important for the fabric of the province, and we provide well-paying, stable, family-based jobs.
Yeah, so you did talk about kind of the impact on the Alberta economy. Um, Two questions. First, like, what if I'm going to buy lumber in the near future? Like, what is that going to look like from a consumer basis? And then I'll come to the second one after that. But we'll start there. Like, what does that look like from me being a person going to Home Depot?
Well, so we have, from a lumber perspective, about 50% of the Alberta lumber stays within Canada, so it's domestically purchased. About 50, the other 50% is exported. Of that exports, about 95% goes into the United States. And so a U.S. consumer is going to see not only the duties that they're currently having to pay, but they could see the 25% on top of that tariff. So you're going to see an inflationary pressure perspective from the U.S. consumer perspective, which is going to make housing much more expensive in the United States. From a domestic perspective, you could see an escalation of cost as well, or you could see a flooding of the market. So it's too soon to know which way it's going to go domestically. But from a U.S. consumer perspective, there's going to be definitely inflationary pressure on the lumber side. And that's not even talking about the pulp side. So pulp as well, we export about 87% of our pulp that's produced in Alberta. And of that 87%, almost half of that goes to the United States. And it's used for feedstock, for paper towels, for fabrics that are used in hospitals and the like. And it's high quality fiber. It is well sought after. Because of our slow growing cycles here, the fiber comes very dense and very long and very white. So it is really sought after. And so if you all of a sudden tack 25% on the feedstock coming in from us to the United States, it's going to definitely do a cost escalation. It's interesting. Pulp, I would say, is not dissimilar to the oil and gas sector here in the province in that strong feedstock. We produce it here. It goes in the United States to Wisconsin, to Pennsylvania, to a few other states, Minnesota. And then they turn around, they process it in a finalized product, and we buy it back. Very similar to what happens with our heavy crude that goes into the Gulf Coast, and then we buy it back refined.
Yeah, that actually was going to be my second question was like, again, that we've seen the government of Alberta be very, very hard on going down on missions to the States to talk about oil and gas. This is our second largest sector. And like you said, it's the message that the premier has been saying is, it's a give and take relationship. What I'm hearing is a give and take. Can you maybe talk about some of the advocacy or conversations that you and your counterparts across the country are having to try and mitigate maybe some of these impacts?
Absolutely. So I was actually in Washington, D.C. in February, joined by a number of my provincial colleagues and national colleagues doing just that, doing the advocacy. The National Association of Home Builders has been a long-standing advocate for us in the country on softwood lumber. So we certainly met with them. They've been very supportive in putting out news releases and really doing lots of hill calls. We did lots of intelligence gathering with officials within the embassy as well. But on top of that, I'm actually joining our Forestry Minister, Minister Lone, next week to go to Texas. And Texas, we have a number of our companies that sell their products into Texas. We actually have one of our companies in particular that have at least 4 mills in Texas. So a Canadian company that has strong investment roots within Texas. So we're going down there to really, both of you know, advocacy is a contact sport. You need to be down there. You need to see the whites of the eyes of the individuals you're meeting with. And you need to showcase the partnership approach that we take with our sector. And we really want to make sure that we have Americans talking to Americans about the importance of the partnership that our industry brings to their consumers and as well as to their mill workers, because there's hundreds of thousands of jobs in the United States that depend on forestry products coming from Alberta and across Canada.
Jason, I want to back up a little bit because I think for a lot of people, we're wondering, like, especially if you haven't been focused in the sector, like, how did we get here? Because the U.S. is saying that, the Canadian industry is subsidized, and that's the reason that they've taken the steps that they have and the reason that they'll take future steps. Could you just break down that myth for us?
Absolutely. Well, in fact, the softwood lumber dispute is Canada and U.S.'s longest standing trading war. In fact, we go back centuries, or at least a century. But the modern trade war in lumber is actually on its round 5, and it fundamentally comes down to how our systems are ran from a forestry perspective. So we actually, in the United States, logs are paid for at the gate. So basically, it's lots of private ownership of land, and most of the companies are actually buying from private landowners. Where here in Canada, most of the harvesting that occurs across Canada, there's a couple of exceptions in New Brunswick, but for the most part, harvesting and forestry is actually done on public land. So basically Crown land or government land. And so our companies pay a stumpage fee into the provincial government for the right to actually have access to the land. But with that right comes a ton of extra obligations that don't get synced into the stumpage dues. So what does that mean? So we do active forest management plan. We plan in 200-year cycles, but it also means we're planning in 50-year cycles, and we're putting in plans that are 10 years, 5 years, 1 year in, just to showcase what we're going to do on the landscape. Also not included in that stumpage fees are Indigenous consultations. We do a ton of Indigenous consultations within the areas that we're looking to harvest. We build roads, but then we reclaim those roads once the harvesting is done. And on top of that, we have an obligation to reforest the lands that we've harvested. So we basically grow 3 trees for every tree that we harvest. And then we have an obligation for 14 years after that seeding is done to make sure those seeds actually take hold. So a lot of that obligation isn't factored into the pricing that we put out there from a stumpage perspective. So we basically are paying to manage the forest, whereas the United States, they're paying to buy the log.
Interesting.
So-
Go ahead, Cheryl.
Oh, I was just going to say, okay, so we're at this place now where, who knows what's going to happen with the US? It's changing from day to day, as we all know. In terms of what we as a country can do, which is where a lot of eyes and minds have turned to now, what can we do to protect our industries and our jobs and our products? Is there a list of things that you're looking for from the provincial government and from the federal government right now?
Absolutely. So we already talked about the advocacy piece, and we're going to continue to do that. Our government has been very strong provincially in getting out there and doing that contact sport of white to the eyes and do the advocacy, again, from a messaging around getting to have Americans talk to Americans. So that's one piece. Second piece is keeping our regulatory and policy environment, our regulatory costs low, and our policy environment very strong in the province. And we are very fortunate in Alberta that we actually have a very strong policy environment for forestry, and we have a low cost jurisdiction. So that's the second thing we're doing is working with our provincial government to make sure that those costs stay low and our policy environment stays strong. Third, and this is something we're starting to ramp up our advocacy around, is we can do much more in Alberta and in Canada about building more with wood. So we're having active conversations with the provincial government and a number of our municipal leaders about more wood in government procurement, whether that's schools, whether that's hospitals. I mean, it is the best building material in the world, and we produce it here in the province. And so we would like to see more use of domestic wood. We also have a strong need for housing in the country. We've got a homeless and a housing crisis and a homeless crisis. So we'd like to see initiatives federally where we actually rely more on wood for that. And then talking more medium to long-term market diversification. Certainly we will never be able to replace the importance of the U.S. market, but we actually have strong relationships already in Japan and Korea. And in fact, Minister Lowen joined our industry to do a trade mission to Japan last fall. Very successful. We'd like to see more of that, both provincially and nationally. Japan, Korea, China, India is certainly an interest from a pulp perspective. Even the Middle East could be an interest from a pulp perspective. So we need to continue to diversify our markets, and that's something we're doing provincially. We're also talking to our association partners across the country to do that. And then on the federal side, we are certainly active conversations around some backstopping. So with the softwood lumber duties that are sitting with the U.S. Treasury, and there's almost over $10 billion sitting there on deposit that have been paid by Canadian companies, we're asking the federal government to look at some low interest loans to help us with liquidity over the next 12 to 18 months, backstopped by those dollars that are sitting that have already been paid by Canadian companies. So we're not looking for government handouts. It's leveraging dollars that are sitting there that have been paid for by our sector. So lots of things that we're looking at. We're even tossing around the idea of a forestry manufacturing tax credit. A bit of a long-term game, but there's lots that we can be doing. But more than anything, if your listeners can just buy more wood. We'd love to see the domestic use go up.
Okay, Jason, before we let you go, you've shared so much with us, but is there anything for our listeners besides buy more wood that you want to leave them with today, maybe about a message around the tariffs, or, just generally about the industry that they might not know?
Absolutely. Well, despite what the U.S. administration and President Trump says, the U.S. industry cannot be and will not be self-sufficient from a lumber perspective. They can be self-sufficient up to about 70%, and basically they import about 30% of their lumber needs. They have a housing need anywhere annually from a $1.3 to $1.5 million housing units. And so they import almost 30% of that. And we're the ones that import or export the lion's share of that. So it is an important market for us. And despite efforts for U.S. to be self-sufficient, they would need about, one of our members has said, about 45 new big-sized mills right across their country to actually be self-sufficient. And that doesn't take into account all the labor and the equipment and everything else. And it's just, so as a result, we know that they need our lumber, but in a partnership way, just like they also need our pulp for a lot of their fiber supplies. So, and I'll just end by actually saying as well, buy with more wood, please.
Thanks, Jason. We really appreciate you spending time on the podcast with us and giving our listeners, which, by the way, our U.S. listenership is growing. So our Canadian listeners and our U.S. listeners, just a little more insight into what the economic impacts are for Canadian.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks.
So the economic threats currently looming over Canada's election has impacted pretty much all of our discourse lately. And Danielle Smith is actually feeling, I imagine, a little bruised this week after a clip from an interview she did with Breitbart surfaced. This was from March 8th.
The longer this dispute goes on, politicians posture, and it seems to be benefiting the Liberals right now. Let's just put things on pause so we can get through an election.
The Premier canceled her public appearances after being accused quite broadly of inciting foreign election interference. Erika, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really buy the whole election interference, scream and shout. It's been addressed. I saw Elections Alberta and Elections Canada basically tweet out like, thank you, but it doesn't meet that threshold. Kind of shut that down. I do think, though, I was like, yeah, we don't have to talk about like Alberta and all that. And then it was like, oh man, really? Like, anyway, so I know we talked about this on Jesperson when we were on Monday. For the record, I didn't shush the Premier. I was saying to all the Conservatives, please be quiet during this period of time, because I do think whenever you have a leader on a campaign trail having to answer for one of your other party members or colleagues, it's never a good thing to have to do and distract from the message you're trying to get. So I think canceling her availability was to show, like, I get the message. I think she's still going down to the States to be on Ben Shapiro this week. So
she is.
Hopefully,
they put out a statement.
Yep. Hopefully, I wish that it was just like, we're going to cancel because it's distracting folks. Although in question period, the Premier kind of doubled down on it. And I'm sure, Cheryl, you have some takes on that before I get back into it.
Well, I do think, honestly, the clip, it's not a good look. And yes, it was filmed before even the Liberal leadership took place. But it sounds like she's saying, like, stop the economic threats against Canada for the sake of the political party that I support, rather than for the sake of Canada. And I don't think that's a good look for Danielle Smith. And I don't think that's a good look for Pierre Poilievre. And, at the very minimum, she messed up a important day on the campaign trail for Pierre Poilievre. And I'm sure that's why she canceled her events, is like, instead of talking about whatever he wanted to talk about that day, he's taking questions on what should be an ally has said publicly.
I will say I was impressed with him just pivoting off of it. Like, she's the Premier, she has position, she's standing up for Alberta, whatever, or she's going to advocate. Like, he didn't even give it that much airtime. He just moved on to like going on the defense of how he would better represent Canada than Mark Carney. So I think he handled it really well in stride. It's just, something that you just don't want to have to answer when you want to be talking about what you want to be talking about. And he had to use his skills to pivot back. But what did you think of her doubling down now? I thought it was like, I thought she was listening on Monday when I said, just don't do that. I wouldn't advise her to go and be in any mainstream setting, nor would I of anyone of the Conservative premiers right now. obviously she didn't hear me.
So I think there's two things I think about it. One is like reading her, because I didn't actually watch it, reading her statement in the House, where she doubles down on this and basically says like, how dare you, she doesn't say it like this, but like, how dare you condemn me for like standing up for our country? Am I supposed to just sit here in Alberta and do nothing and sit on my hands? Like for Danielle Smith to give us all a lesson in diplomacy, like, come on. Like, this is a woman who, on the first time she gets to meet with the new Prime Minister of Canada, who she's building a relationship with, basically lays out a set of demands that are not even realistically attainable and says, like, if you don't like it, like, we're going to blow up the country. That is not diplomacy. Like, yes, she demonstrated she can go meet with Republican governors and be super diplomatic, but she has reserved that for only Americans. And when it comes to Canada, it is just like, do it my way or I will throw a fit. And so reading her statement in the House, it's a bit of a stretch.
I will say I watched it thanks to TikTok and the moments I had to scroll. And her tone was less lectury than I think the way it reads. It was, I think, justifying why and how she's doing it. I just think that there could have been a little bit more tone of humility of like, I'm continuing to do this. I'm continuing to advocate for Alberta and Canada. But I shouldn't be speaking for anyone else or saying there's now attack ads saying that Pierre and Trump are in sync, which is not true in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
You know, Trudeau's been like, I want Carney. And so I just think that giving those sound bites just don't help anyone. So
Yeah,
hopefully
I mean, that's
it.
embarrassing that she is now a part of a Liberal attack ad. Like, that sucks for her.
You
It
were in an
reminded me
attack ad, weren't you?
Never. This reminds me of the second point that I was going to make on this, which is like when I see Danielle Smith do something like this, I do feel a little bit envious that our party has never been able to be so unapologetic about our position on things. We're always like a little wishy-washy, or at least we were in government. Like, we were like quick to sort of, say, we messed up, we're going to fix it, we hear you, which of course is part of government. But when I see parties be like, I don't care what you say, we're going to do what we're going to do, and a lot of people like it, I wish we would have had that strength when we were in government. And so I'm a little bit envious of her ability just to say, like, say what you want. I'm going to do what I want.
And you know what? I would say being at that leaders' dinner, especially in Edmonton, which is not usually like as conservative, rah, as like going to the Calgary or even Red Deer. When she started, like, it was the back half of her speech was one of the best speeches I've heard her give. And the crowd was like so pumped. And it was about her standing up for Alberta and standing up for Canada indirectly. And like, it was a relentless advocacy. And like, I mean, Jason said on our podcast, you have to see the whites of the eyes or whatever he said, that like you have to keep pounding pavement. I just hope that it's not going to distract from the federal campaign. I think she can still do both. And so,
she's gotta be more careful, though.
Relentless. And like, I appreciate you saying that, like, it is not for everyone. I don't think everyone has that tone that they can also get away with it. But it is walking a fine line. And I just think that she's got to think of who she's talking to when she's at the Ben Shapiro event. Like, if it's conservative, the conservative base down there, I actually don't think that's who. I think they've already made up their mind. And I don't know if even Trump's listening to that audience. I think she should use it to just champion how great Alberta or Canada are.
Yeah,
and not politicize it with like, get our boy elected, because she just can't bring anyone else into the conversation.
No, and she has been so good at doing this stuff for political gain. Like, in my opinion, I think all of it has been for political gain. And I've said before, she's a skilled politician. Is it always in the interest of our province or our country? I don't think so. But when it comes to, if her goal is earn political points, like, check, she's done it. Her canceling her political or her public appearances yesterday also helped on another front. She got to hide from the continuing questions on the corrupt care scandal. Do you want to do the honors of offering the latest?
Okay, I thought we were just out of time. We should just not address that today instead. But we'll talk about my favorite topic, AHS. If you didn't see, I mean, last week we talked about the statement of defense from the government, being the Minister of Health that was named in the statement of claim. We also saw, which was harder to find, I didn't get it. It wasn't, an X right away or anything like that. But AHS was also named in that statement of claim, and they've now filed their statement of defense. Again, this is kind of like all of the ones we should expect to see, given that those were the people named by Athana Mentzelopoulos in her statement of claim, which came out earlier this year. I read it. It read like a job description, and it reminded me that this statement of defense is in response to her statement of claim, which had a lot of allegations, but was actually about her being fired or dismissed from her role. So I think that actually AHS has outlined what her job was supposed to do and then why she didn't meet those thresholds. It also explained to me why she was, without cause, because then you can give someone a severance, you can package them out. It wasn't that it wasn't with cause, but in order for someone to collect pay and be kind of packaged out, you have to be without cause. So I think that was a weird, muddy one for people. But the section 9 and 10 is really where, if you're going to read the synopsis, really where the meat and potatoes are of this very HR written statement of defense.
I'm going to give us all a break from Erika's voice.
Oh my God, thank you. I'm like,
so basically, if you read through this statement of defense, it is definitely not as fiery as the previous, like the Crown statement of defense, which is very editorialized. This one is basically like saying Athana Mentzelopoulos did not carry out her duties and responsibilities. She was ineffective. She failed to execute her key leadership responsibilities. It spends a lot of time laying out what the agreement was between her and her employer in terms of what she was expected to do, and then making the case that she failed to do those things, that she didn't demonstrate leadership, that she didn't demonstrate sound judgment or strategy, she wasn't a rational decision maker, that it also says she was engaged in unprofessional conduct with employees of AHS, which I imagine is related to a specific incident. I have no idea. Mm-hmm. It says that she refused to effectively communicate with AHS staff, and that she wasn't, basically in summary, that she wasn't effectively implementing the refocus plan that she had been hired to implement. So this one is much less spicy than the government's version, but as you said, makes the case that is trying to make the case really clearly that if Athana Mentzelopoulos is saying that she was fired unjustly, that she's owed $1.7 million, it's making the case that she was fired within the terms of her contract.
Yeah, and so, this is, I think, what we would have expected the tone to be. This one didn't have as much colorful language, if at all, compared to the one from the government and the Minister of Health. Where do you see this going from here? Like you said last week that something wasn't written to go to court. This one seems like a court-worthy document. Where do you think this ends up? And by no means do we have any insight. We are just speculating here, folks. But I still don't think going to court would be in the best interest of anyone, especially the government.
I think it depends. It depends what each party has for discovery. Like I still maintain, based on the Crown statement of defense, I don't think they intend to take that to court. I think that was helpful in the media narrative and that they intend to settle, because if we go through an entire trial process here, it will be, even if the government wins, it will be very embarrassing and reputationally damaging for them to have potentially Athana Mentzelopoulos present emails and texts and recordings, and that makes the government not look good even if they win. So I just can't see the government seeing this through to a trial, but I have been wrong about this government so many times before.
Me too. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, there's some things in here that you mentioned, there's a few that stood out for me. Like you said, an unprofessional conduct with staff and things like that might be a little bit juicier than maybe some of the other didn't meet requirements, subjective, or didn't have a strong relationship with board, subjective. So it's a little bit harder to prove. But again, we keep coming back to this reputation management and perception. I think it's going to be hard to control if you have something on trial, the Depp Heard thing trial was very we're all going to eat with popcorn and watch, right?
I will definitely.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, because you just love, in your words, when I wave these around like a lunatic, here's my highlighted version.
my
There is
gosh.
one line in it that did stand out to me because the government has been trying to make this case, the Crown and the minister have been trying to make this case like we have nothing to do with this. This is between you and AHS. You didn't fulfill your contract. AHS fired you. But it's lines like this, and there's a couple in this. The plaintiff's repeated unwillingness to and outright refusal to meet the expectations and priorities set by the health minister not only stalled essential progress, but actively disrupted the operational and structural advancements required for refocus plan. When they keep saying like, you didn't do what the minister asked you, you didn't do what the minister asked you, you didn't do what the minister asked you, I think it's actually working counter to the idea that they're trying to present that the minister was hands off in this. The minister had nothing to do with it. They've made the case in this statement of defense and in the other one over and over. The minister was right there the whole time.
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference. And I would argue that that's more like the mandate given by the minister on the outset of here's the refocusing plan, you execute it. That was the only one that also stood out to me because everything else says like your key stakeholders, including yada, yada, and mentioning the ministry. And they include them as key stakeholders. Oh, the board, and there was a few others named. But I that one did stand out for me too because it was the only one that had the minister stand alone. But I think what they're trying to say is, upon outset, like the minister was very clear on what they were doing. She was there for a mandate and to, report to a board and the minister, and she was not doing that.
Yeah.
So I get where you're coming from, but I still think like if you have to explain it, you're losing. So
yeah, and truthfully, like if I'm the government on this side, like here's your options now. You go forward with this in a court, and you have like 1,000 more stories written about every single detail of every single day, and this drags out, potentially up to the next election. Or you settle, you get a shitty story about settling, and it's over. And in most settlements, the plaintiff has to sign an NDA.
Right. Yeah. And again, I don't know if that solves the other question, though, that people are raising about procurement. And so I still think all of those reports go out. Right. And that's what I mean. Like the more I read and with these statement of defense, the isolated issue, which is Athana's dismissal, is very isolated from maybe all the other questions through her allegations. That's opened up a different can of worms, different story and timeline. But what is the rest of it? I still think that there's impact for the government one way or the other. But folks, I'm going to give you all a break from this hideous voice that I don't even know how I acquired. Woke up like this a couple days ago. We did get through all of our topics, whether we both wanted to talk about them or not today. And so I'm going to go rest my voice. New episodes drop every Thursday at 5 a.m. So set those alarms and don't forget to follow us on X, Instagram, and TikTok.
And you can like and subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
The Discourse is hosted by Cheryl Oates and Erika Barudis. Follow on Instagram at The Discourse Pod. Subscribe to The Discourse on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.